In the first video in this series, I mentioned how you can source free or very cheap vintage hardware from places like OfferUp, Craigslist, Facebook, etc. But let's not overlook neighborhood garage sales. They too are a great source of finding vintage hardware at a very good price, or even for free. Another good event is Bulk Trash Day, that special day when all the old furniture and heavy items are put on the curb for those special trucks. But going back to OfferUp, I happened to be browsing OfferUp one day looking for vintage radios and I came across these nice Sony speakers that were released about 30 years ago. As you can see, the speaker on the right has a very faded fabric grille which is more of a brown color, unlike the one on the left which is still black. You will also notice that the cover for the breathe hole is also missing, so I figured that maybe that speaker was beside a sliding door or a window and it got some direct sunlight, which would explain the faded grille. I made arrangements to meet up with the seller to do an inspection, and based on the price he was asking, I decided it would be worth it to purchase these speakers and do a restoration. Now, used speakers in general do not sell very well unless they're a top brand with some good specs. These Sony speakers were a top of the line model when they came out and costed a pretty penny back in the late 80s and early 90s. However, that being said, very few people would be able to appreciate the value of these speakers. So I had to be careful not to spend too much on a renovation, as I would not be able to recover much in case I decide to sell it later on. Here you can see me doing a disassembly of one of the speaker boxes. The first thing I do is remove the grills and store them properly. After a closer inspection of the speakers, I begin to remove them and store them in a box along with the screws that hold them in place. I normally put the screws in a small plastic bag and then tape that bag to one of the speakers so I don't lose them. Next, I use some painter's tape to protect the connectors from paint and moisture because I don't want them to corrode. Now, I don't have a garage, so these speakers will be sleeping outside, and even though I'll be covering them up to protect them from the elements, I still need to keep the moisture and the air off the connectors. My plan is to paint these speaker boxes white because although the wood veneer doesn't look too bad, white speakers are rare and I figure I can get more money for white speakers should I decide to sell them one day. Besides, although the veneer doesn't look too bad, restoring them to an almost new matching condition would cost much more than a simple paint and finish. The next thing I'm doing here is taping off the Sony logo and model number plates. I want both items to keep their original look even though I'm changing the color. And while I'm doing that, I make sure to use my shop vac to clean all cobwebs, dust, and any other items that may have settled inside the speaker box. If you're buying stuff off OfferUp or Facebook Marketplace, etc., I also recommend that you walk with a portable vacuum and disinfecting wipes, just in case you need to stick stuff in your car that has been stored in a damp place for a long time. Mold and other types of fungi can grow on vintage electronics, so you want to make sure that you don't get you or your family sick. Of course, if you have an open back vehicle or a van with a cargo bay that's sealed off from the passenger cabin, then you're good. But even then, I recommend using a good KN95 mask and gloves. Of course, some people store their electronics well, so not all situations will require these precautions. But walk with them anyway, just in case. That way you don't have to drive to a store at the last moment to buy them. If you don't have a van, try wrapping whatever you buy in plastic so that no insects or microbes escape into your car while transporting the equipment. Now, as you can see from this next video, the dust cap on the woofer in the second speaker box is badly deteriorated, and that's something I already knew I would have to change. On speakers this old where the dust caps went bad because of age, I highly recommend that you replace them as a pair. Later on I'll show you how to do that. Here, I'm just using some brown paper to stuff the speaker holes so that the padding inside the speaker boxes doesn't get filled with paint. After that, I use a sandpaper block on a sponge base to lightly sand the veneer. Now I do that for two reasons. One, to remove any impurities that might prevent the paint from sticking, and two, to create a smooth and consistent surface that will allow the paint to stick. Now there were a few gouges in the speaker box, so I used some wood filler to fix those, and after the patches dried, I sanded them. While those patches were drying, I had seized the opportunity to prep the subwoofer for painting, and I also planned to paint it white. This is an older 10-inch subwoofer whose amplifier circuit had failed, but apart from that it was in excellent condition. Now there's another video on my channel that I did some time ago about fixing subwoofers by simply swapping out the circuit boards, so I won't go into too much detail. Suffice it to say that I did some research, found out that the speaker in the subwoofer was rated at 100 watts, and so I bought a new board that was also rated at 100 watts. And just like I did with the Sony speakers, I did some light sanding to prep the surface. The next step was to actually start painting the speakers with a can of spray paint, and I'm using a white paint with a gloss finish. Now I'm not going to explain too much about using spray paint. There's another video I did where I go into great detail about using spray paint, so I'll put that link in the description below. While I paint, there are three important things I'm using. The first one is a respirator mask, and even though I'm not in an enclosed area, I do not want spray paint or the fumes from the paint getting into my airways or into the bloodstream. Before spray paint becomes completely dry, it releases chemicals that can mess with the hormones in your body and cause all sorts of health problems, especially in women. In addition to my respirator, I'm also using a handle to squeeze that button on the spray paint can. The reason I'm doing that is due to the fact that after a while, paint will accumulate on the nozzle of the can and get onto your finger. The chemicals in the paint will then filter into your body and your bloodstream and cause all the problems I just mentioned. The third thing I'm using, which you can't see in this video but you'll probably see later on in the video, is my noise cancelling Bluetooth headphone. I was completely blown away by these headphones that cost less than $100, but yet they sound so good. The noise cancelling feature also comes in very handy when I'm using power tools, and for those of you who are curious, this is the Spotify playlist I listen to when doing DIY projects. Now, going back to the Sony speakers, there were some small gouges and dents that were simply too small to be patched, so I just filled them in with some wood glue and used painter's tape to keep those lines and angles. While the spray paint dried, I worked on cleaning up the speakers. Next, I worked on preparing the new amplifier plate. Since it was not a perfect match as far as dimensions are concerned, I removed the electronics from the previous plate and then cut a hole in it where I was able to mount the new plate. Here you can see me screwing everything together with black nuts and bolts. After that, I made sure to do a test, just to make sure that the amplifier was working and that there were no issues with the speaker. Now I did notice what looked like mold on the speaker grills, so I sprayed them down with some Lysol and then left them out in the sunlight to dry. A day after, I wiped them down and put them through a dyeing process. Now if you recall from the first part of this video, one of those speaker grills was no longer black, rather it had faded to brown, probably because of excessive exposure to sunlight. By dyeing both grills, I hope to create a color match. I'm going to provide a link below that explains how to do the dyeing, but basically it involves keeping them submerged in hot water with a dye added, and then moving them around every few minutes. The next step is to replace the dye water in the container with some warm water, and then add some color stay. Next, I place the speaker grills in. The purpose of the color stay is to fix the dye in place and prevent it from running. Once I got to the point where the water was no longer getting any darker, it was time to remove the grills. Unfortunately, the brown colored grill did not absorb enough of the dye, so after it dried, I used some flat black spray paint to darken the grill. I figured that the grill has a lot of synthetic fibers and that did not allow it to absorb the dye as well as plant fibers would. While the paint on the grill dried, it was time to assemble the subwoofer, whose second coat of paint as well as a clear coat were now dry. You'll also notice in this video and the videos that I'll be releasing in the coming weeks that not only my drill but all my battery powered tools are Ryobi. Now I belong to some professional groups on Facebook and there are people who bash Ryobi as a brand no true professional would use, but I tend to disagree. I've been using their battery powered tools for years and I've never had an issue. I assure you that Ryobi is not paying me to say this and they probably don't even know I exist. I'm saying it because it's true, and if you plan to do custom jobs like these for customers, having a set of Ryobi battery powered tools to carry around is so convenient. I've provided links below in the description to the whole suite of Ryobi battery powered tools that I use. With the subwoofer complete, it was now time to finish up work on the Sony floor standing speakers. Here you can see me working on the frame for the breathe hole. You'll recall that one of the speaker boxes was missing a breathe hole, so I reached out to Fabrice at West Palm Beach Plastics and had them cut a matching piece from black acrylic. However, that piece did not have this connecting bar going down the middle, so I had to remove it from the frame on the other speaker box. With that complete, I covered the frame in spray adhesive and then attached a new grill fabric that I had purchased off Amazon. While the fabric on the breathe hole frames dried, I began to replace the deteriorated dust caps on the speakers. To do so, all you have to do is to warm up the adhesive that holds the dust cap in place and then lift it off. There's a special tool for heating up this kind of stuff and I'll provide the link for that below, but I don't have one, so I used my wife's hair dryer. Please do me a solid and don't tell my wife because she would not be happy. But as the saying goes, it's better to ask forgiveness than to ask permission. So with the old dust cap off, I could now put the new one on. And of course I used some painter's tape to hold it in place while it dried. That little toolkit that you see me using in many of the videos, it also comes with little tweezers that I use to lift the dust caps off. I'll provide a link for that also in the description below. It's a very useful toolkit to have. Magnets hold the cover in place, and it has all the screwdriver tips you'll ever need for working on electronics or computers. With the grills all set to go, it was time for the final step of the painting process. Having taped off all the finished surfaces as well as the speaker terminals, I now use some flat black spray paint to do the back of the speaker box. And this is the end result. It appears that these speakers did not have any veneer around the base originally, so I used some black puff paint to fill in the compressed wood base. Apart from holding the wood together, it would also absorb sound as well as hide the base and prevent it from standing out. There were a few spots where the paint didn't hold very well, but using my color repair kit that I got from Amazon, I was able to fix those. When you refurbish and renovate vintage audio, regardless of how it looks, never sell it as new. Just list it as used and in good condition. That way your buyers will never be disappointed. And unless you're getting commissioned work from a customer to do a custom finish on speaker boxes, try not to spend too much because you more than likely will not be able to recover what you spent. In this case, I was convinced that changing the color to white was a much better option to trying to fix the wooden finish. Since I don't have a garage and I could not bring the speakers inside because of the fresh paint, I covered them with a blanket to prevent dewdrops from forming on the surface, and I also covered them with a sheet of plastic in case it rained. During the painting process, I wrapped them in plastic first since they were on the ground, and then I covered the plastic with a blanket. The heavy blanket would absorb the water and prevent the wind from opening the plastic, and the plastic would keep the water off the speakers. With all the painting completed and cured, it was now time to reconnect the speakers. Now I can start peeling off the tape from the logo and model number plate. And finally, I can put the grills on. In the end, I got the finish I wanted. A nice, smooth, glossy finish that still allows you to see the grain in the wood veneer. The sandpaper I used was 320 grit because I didn't want too smooth of a finish. Remember, these boxes are relatively heavy, and if the finish is too smooth, they will be slippery, which means they might slip out of your hand when moving them around a room or transporting them to a vehicle. So far, we've seen the subwoofer, but what about the Sony speakers? Although this was a budget restoration, they also came out very nice. Now, if you were to do this, don't think that you would need tons of money. A sandpaper block, wood glue, and a few cans of paint are relatively cheap, but they can achieve so much. In the end, this is what they sounded like. The microphone on my camera did not do the speakers justice. Trust me on that, because they sound much better live. If you have any questions, feel free to post them in the comment section below and I'll answer them as soon as possible. If you don't want to miss part 3, remember to subscribe so that you can get the notification as soon as the video drops.